You're watching a video from TheAlley Church, located in Cottage Grove, Minnesota.
But Luke, if you have a Bible this morning, I want to spend some time looking at how Luke records what God has done. And I think it's important for us this morning because I don't think you have to look hard enough at our world and at our culture to see that something's wrong. I don't think you have to spend a lot of time on TV or radio to recognize that something's off. I mean, as we look at the tragedy and we look at some of the senseless tragedy and chaos and some of the ugliness that's happening in the world, it doesn't take much to see that there's something off, that there's something wrong. And as we spend some time the next couple of weeks, it's going to be kind of odd because as we talk about some of that, I don't think you're going to leave here with like anything practical. I don't think you're going to leave here with like, well, if I just do these three things, it'll help me get through tragedy. I don't think that's going to happen these next few weeks together as we prepare for Christmas. Which you're probably like, well, great, what did I get dressed up and come to church for? And I get it. Everybody comes to church for different reasons. And but I think there's something that God may want to teach us today, because sometimes you run against some stuff in God's word, and sometimes you come up against some stuff in life. If I can just be frank this morning, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. There's some things that happen in life. There's stuff that happens in life, and it just doesn't always make sense. The news doesn't always make sense. What's happening to you personally doesn't always make sense. So, and I think I know what's behind it, right? We always want to know when tragedy happens and when we're watching it, and it even happens to us personally, like our first gut level reaction is to ask why, right? Like, why is it happening? Or why is this happening to me? Or why is this happening in our world? There's a sense in all of us, I think, that wants to find purpose behind what we're experiencing. We want to know, we want an explanation for why he left. We want an explanation on why she got sick. We want an explanation on why that, when we turn on our television, why that's happening over there. Because there's something in you and there's something in me that needs to make sense of it, that needs to have purpose behind it. And so we're watching it and we're experiencing and we're asking why. And the reason why we're asking why is because we need an explanation. We need to know that there's a purpose behind what we're feeling, a purpose behind what we're experiencing. It's even in our language. I mean, have you heard yourself lately? It's in our language. This is why we say things like, everything happens for a reason. I mean, that's why we say that. Because we want to believe that what we're experiencing and what we're watching and the hardship that we're going through and the tragedy that we're experiencing and the pain we're experiencing, we want to believe there's a reason behind it. And so we say things like, everything happens for a reason. We say things like, you just haven't met the right person yet. You ever heard that one? You just haven't, it's not you. You just haven't met the right person yet, right? Because we're trying to make sense on why we haven't found the one yet. Or we say things like, and this one, I don't know if you've ever heard this, I guess it wasn't meant to be, right? Because it's even in our language that when tragedy happens, when the unexplained happens, we want an explanation. When the unplanned happens, we want to know there's a bigger plan. It's in every single one of us. I mean, just think about it. Nobody plans for divorce. Nobody plans for that. I mean, our plan is, look, I'm going to meet him, I'm going to meet her, and then one day we're going to get engaged, and then we're going to get great jobs, and then we're going to move into this great neighborhood, into this great house, and then we're going to have kids, and our life is just going to be, it's going to be great. But listen, nobody plans for when things don't work out. Nobody plans for that. Or what about your job? Like, you were the type of person that could never lose a job. You were the type of person everybody wanted you working for them. Some of you, you started the place. You started the business, and you thought, there's no way I'll ever lose this. And what happened? You lost it. They asked you to leave the company you started. I mean, what do you do with that? What do you do when the plan doesn't seem to be what you thought it was going to be? And what's in us that needs to know the purpose? What's in it that needs to know the explanation? What is it in me that needs to know the explanation? Do you know that that's very distinct to us? Do you know that's very distinct to human beings, to know the purpose and the why and the reason and the explanation behind all the stuff we experience? Do you know that's very distinct to us? And let me just give you an example. I have this dog in my house. His name is Milo, okay? Milo's interesting, to say the least. Because here's what happens with Milo. Milo wakes up in the morning, lets us all know he's up. Milo eats, and then Milo finds a spot in the house to go back to bed. Right? And here's the thing, I don't think Milo is thinking, I wonder what this nap has to do with yesterday's nap, and the day before that nap, and then the nap that's going to come tomorrow, and one day all those naps are going to make sense, and it's going to give the reason why all I do is sleep. Like, I don't think he's thinking about that, right? And every day I'm looking at Milo, bro, go get a job. Go get a job, bro. But listen, it's very distinct to us. And here's the thing, what is it that's in you and what is it that's in me that has to know the purpose, that has to have an explanation, that has to have a plan? What's interesting is I think that's the thumbprint of God on you, to be honest with you. I don't think that needing to want to know and to have an explanation on why you're going through what you're going through, I don't think that should be ignored, because I think that's the image of God at work in you. That there has to be something bigger. There has to be something greater. That's actually the image of God that's imprinted on every single person. And you may not believe in God. You may not even want God, but there's an image that's imprinted on you from the moment you were created. And that's why you have to know what the plan is. That's why you have to know what the explanation is. That's why you have to know why you're going through what you're going through. And I think for all of us today, as we think about maybe some of the stuff we're seeing, maybe you're here this morning and you got some news that you weren't expecting to get. Maybe you're here this morning and a family member got some news that you weren't expecting them to get. And you're wondering why. You're wondering what's the purpose behind it. The truth is, the reason why we ask that is because there's something deeper going on, and it's actually embedded on us. It's actually a part of who we are to want to know the purpose and to want to know the explanation and to want to know the plan. And here's the thing about when it comes to Christianity. We believe, without a doubt, there is a purpose. We believe that even though we don't always know and we can't always explain it, that there is in fact a reason and there's a purpose. And just because God seems silent doesn't mean he's absent. There's just something embedded in us, and there's something that a believer does, that when they're going through tragedy, it doesn't make sense, and they get the news, and they're watching the chaos, and they're watching all the ugliness in the world. There's something that inside of them reminds them that they're embedded with this purpose, this plan. And that just because God seems silent does not mean God is absent. And listen, the Christmas story is the best example of that. The Christmas story, the way Luke writes it, is the best explanation, and it cannot be ignored. It's the best example of God dipping down into the ugliness of life and the chaos of life and the unanswered stuff of life. That is the Christmas story. In fact, Luke, one of the writers of the Christmas story, reminds us, as even before he begins to write the Christmas story, look at some of the words he says. Look at Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Look at this. Look at some of the words he uses before he even starts to share the Christmas story. Look at what he says in verse 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of things. In other words, Luke is saying there's another story. There's another narrative that's happening here that have been accomplished among us, just as though who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past. Watch what he says. To write an orderly account for you, that you may have certainty. Do you see that? That you would have certainty concerning the things that have been taught. So Luke, before he even writes the Christmas story, before he even gets into the details of the Christmas story, here's what he writes. He says this: there is purpose. There is certainty. Now, why is it that important that Luke writes that? Here's why. Because prior to that, think about this. Prior to that, God had been silent for 400 years. So the people he's writing to, as they're reading this, he's saying, listen, I need you to know that what I'm about to say, there is some certainty and purpose in it. Here's why. Because God hadn't spoken for 400 years. Some of you don't think God has been present this week. Can you imagine 400 years where it doesn't seem like God's talking? Where it seems like God's not in the details? Where it doesn't seem like God is present? Can you imagine 400 years of that? And so Luke, before he even writes, he says, I need you to know that this has been passed down from eyewitnesses. That what's about to be shared is certain, that there is purpose. Because when you start reading this, it's going to seem like God's distant when you start to read the Christmas story. Here's what Luke is saying. Even though God may seem silent, it does not mean that God is not present. And so he's writing this to people who haven't heard from God, seen God, or experienced God for 400 years. And here's what we'll find in the Christmas story. It's the best picture. It's the best example that from time to time, God drops in the most unimaginable ways to remind us, I'm with you. I'm there. Even if you don't see it, and even if you don't feel it, even if all of your circumstances are screaming the opposite, here's what you can be confident. I'm there. I'm with you when you got the news. I'm with you when they left. I'm with you when it doesn't make sense. I'm with you when the bottom falls out. And there's no better story in the Scriptures. There's no greater narrative in the Scriptures than the Christmas story. Let's look at that together. Look at Luke chapter 2. We're going to start with verse 1, and we're going to read through verse 12. And I'm going to stop along the way, because I think you got to see some of this. You just can't make this stuff up. I think you got to see this. Luke 2, verse 1. It says, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. So here's just a couple things we got to see in the Christmas story. From the very beginning, here's what there was: a government order where Caesar wanted to count all the people he had. So there is this huge order that's given out. So Mary and Joseph, who are likely the last thing on their minds was to travel, they have to, because of the law, pick up themselves and go. This law, this decree. Now, here's the thing. I don't ever want to speak as from something that I haven't experienced, but I'm pretty sure that most pregnant women in their final stages are probably not wanting to travel. Okay, I'm not trying to speak from experience, but I'm pretty sure that the time that a couple plans their vacation isn't the last week of the pregnancy. Let's get on a plane, babe, right? That's probably not. But here, I'm telling you, Mary and Joseph, the last thing that was probably on their mind is let's pick up and go. And yet this unplanned decree that happens is causing them to, and listen, let's not even bring up how she got pregnant. Because that's a whole, can you imagine Mary, the circumstances for how she got pregnant, and her family watching her and seeing her as she begins showing, and they got questions? Can you imagine this? And then let's not even talk about Joseph. Joseph, who finds out his wife's pregnant. Now, I don't know what kind of guy you are, but I'd have some questions behind that. And if your only answer to me is the Holy Spirit, we're going to have some issues, okay? But this is all going on in the background. All of the unplannedness. And listen, not only that, but they're supposed to pick up and go. And when they go to the rental place, there's no cars. All they got is a donkey. That's all they got that's left. Like some of us can't even travel without being in first class. But here, listen, all of it unplanned, all of it chaotic, all of it. And yet they move. It's unplanned. And then look at verse 6. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. That's great. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. See, nobody told all of the hotel owners that everybody and their mom was coming. And so there's no room left for them. Now, here's what's interesting. The only thing that's left for Mary to put her child in is a feeding trough. The dirtiest, ugliest thing that a mom could ever imagine placing her newborn child in. Some of you would have lost your mind if you had to put your kid in that. None of this planned. All of it unplanned. Not probably what they were hoping for. That's not how they were hoping to bring their first child into the world. So she places her baby in a feeding trough. We hadn't even got to verse 8 yet, and look at the chaos. That's just the first 7 verses. And you sense the unplannedness and the ugliness and the chaos. But they weren't the only ones in the narrative. Look at verse 8. And in the same region, there were shepherds out in the field. What were they doing? Shepherd stuff. Keeping watch over their flock by night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with great fear. Of course they were afraid. They'd heard from God for 400 years. And all of a sudden there's some people and angels screaming at them. Of course they're afraid. God hadn't shown up in 400 years. And all of a sudden they're experiencing this. I mean, who isn't filled with fear when the unexpected happens? Who isn't filled with fear when unplanned events happen? Who isn't afraid when they experience pain and sorrow and heartache? Who isn't afraid when things happen that we're not ready for? And we know this was the initial reaction because look how the angels respond in verse 10. They said, don't be afraid. Because I got good news for you. You probably thought it was going to be bad news, but it's good news. Of great joy that'll be for all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. Look at this, verse 12. Underline this. This is very important. And this will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped and swaddled in clothes and lying, and he says it again, in a manger. So he says, this will be a sign to you. Well, what does that mean? It means that you're going to see something in the midst of all of the chaos, in the midst of all the ugliness and the brokenness and the heartache. You're going to see something that's going to be confident for you that God's still there. This is the sign that you're going to see in the midst of all of the mess, in the midst of all of the ugliness, in the midst of she left, in the midst that they got sick, in the midst of it's over. In that moment, Luke says, you're going to see a sign. You're going to see a sign that there's something that'll give us an explanation. There's something that's going to give us purpose. There's going to be something that's going to remind us there is a bigger plan. So what's the sign? It's not swaddling clothes, because every kid back then was wearing swaddling clothes. What was the sign? What if the sign was the manger? What if the sign was a king in a manger? Now, why would that be a sign? Because no royalty kid would be caught found in a manger. There would be a gold-plated crib for him. But not this king. This king, the sign is he comes in a feeding trough. He comes in the most ugly, dirtiest way possible. That's the sign. Do you know that Luke's the only writer who actually uses the word manger? He's the only one that uses the word manger. There's something about Luke that says, I understand that in the unplanned moments and in the chaos and in the brokenness of life, there's this sign from God that God is actually involved and he's present in the dirt and the ugliness of life. And the greatest sign that you can see isn't some king who's sitting in some royal house. It's a king who's lying in a manger. That's the sign. That's the sign that there is purpose, that God is actually present, that he's not distant. I mean, think about this. God had 7 centuries or more to plan the details of the incarnation of Christ. 7 centuries. You think that maybe God could have planned it a little bit different, but he didn't. He brought him. He brought Jesus in a manger. What's the point? What's the point he's making? He's making the point of, you don't know what I'm doing in the bigger picture of things. I have a bigger plan. I have a bigger purpose. I have a bigger explanation. And there he is, Jesus, lying right where God had planned, in a manger. See, the manger teaches us something about the one who's lying in it. See, the manger teaches us that in the unexpected, unplanned, the ugliness, there's this most lowly place. And that Jesus, as he enters, he begins low and he ends even lower on a cross. That's what the manger shows us. It reminds us that God comes low and he finishes even lower on a cross. Why? What's the purpose? What's behind all that? Why bring a baby, a king, into a manger, a dirty, filthy manger? Why would you do that? And I think Paul gives some suggestion why. Look at Romans 5:8. But God shows his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. In other words, when you and I had no plan, no purpose of even going towards God, when we had our own agenda and we had our own plan and we had our own purpose, and our purpose was found in our job and our purpose was found in our relationships, and we didn't think we needed anybody, he says right at that time, in your unplanned moment before you even wanted to even call out to God, here's what Paul says. That exact moment, Christ died for you. The manger makes sense. That's what Paul's trying to teach. That's what Luke's trying to teach. There is something bigger going on. There is another plan. There is another purpose. And here's the thing. When we understand the manger, that is part of God's plan, that is part of God's purpose, then it should be really, really clear to us that there can be purpose in our pain. There can be purpose in the heartache. And here's something you may not want to hear this morning. It's not our responsibility to know the plan. It isn't. I mean, I don't know how you were taught about faith. I don't know what church you've come from. I don't know what you were brought up to learn about what faith is. But here's what I can tell you. I don't believe that there's some kind of faith that's going to move God. I don't think the goal for us is to have this kind of exemplary faith where we move God. I think real faith is trusting in God when it doesn't seem like he's moving. That's what I think real faith is. Real faith isn't look at my faith and look how I can get God to bend to my will. Real faith is this, trusting God when it doesn't seem like God's moving. That's, I think, if you look at the story, the Christmas story, and you look at the manger, I think that's what real faith is. It's trusting God when we don't see everything. It's trusting God when it doesn't make sense all the time. Perfect faith is faith that moves us to trust God when it doesn't seem like God is moving. So your plan might have been, my plan was for us to meet. My plan was for us to finally get engaged. Our plan was to get married and to get a house and to have kids. And then life threw this curve. And I can either go back to my plan or I can trust in his plan. I can trust in him. That the Christmas story reminds us that that's what real faith is. When I don't understand what I'm going through, that I still trust. And Paul says it this way in Ephesians 1:11. Look what he says. In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of what? His will. It's not our responsibility to know the plan. It's our responsibility to trust God in the midst of the ugliness of life when it doesn't seem to be going our way. That's what faith is. Here's how Mary said it. Look at Luke 1:38. This is beautiful. This is how she says it. Watch. And Mary said, behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word. Like, isn't that where God wants to get us? This isn't about, I'm going to walk away and now I have 3 steps to working with tragedy and working through tragedy. I'm just not sure that's the Christmas story. I think the Christmas story is reminding us that in the midst of ugliness, God, let your will be done. Let your word have its way in me. Because what that does is it puts a faith in us, a trust in us, that even when it doesn't feel like God's moving, he can still be trusted. I think that's the story. I think that's the message of Christmas and all of the ugliness and all the unplannedness and all the chaos. God is actually inviting us into this bigger narrative, this bigger story where God does have a purpose. I don't know. I just don't think there's anything that we can give each other that's going to help us make sense out of everything that we go through. But here's what I know. Everything that we go through, maybe it's trying to move us to a trust we have yet to experience. Maybe what we're going through is really trying to move us to a place in a relationship with Jesus that we have yet to really fully experience. And the Christmas story reminds us we were created to look for purpose. And sometimes we find it immediately, and sometimes it happens over time. We're reminded there's a story taking place even though we don't feel like it is. I want to do something this morning. I want to spend some time praying this morning. Because here's what I know, and this because I've been in ministry for some time. Christmas isn't always the merriest time of the year for everybody. You know, there's people that are going to spend Christmas thinking about a loved one they've lost. Do you know that there's going to be couples who are actually making final decisions on their marriage of separating during Christmas? Do you know there's young kids who are in a home where parents are making that final decision? Do you know there's people that are receiving news during Christmas? They're receiving news from the doctor. Do you know that's happening? And in the midst of all that, Christmas isn't always the happiest time of the year. But what if God wanted to do something in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the brokenness, in the midst of the ugliness, in the midst of the bad news? What if God was actually trying to do something to us? What if he was trying to remind us that there's a bigger purpose and there's a bigger plan, and our job isn't to know all the details. Our job and responsibility is to trust the one who knows the details. And that Jesus in a manger, the way God actually chose to come into this world, is proof that in the ugliness, as something that's dirty and ugly as a manger, that's God's explanation. That God's still at work in that. That God, he's got it. So I want to ask you to stand this morning. Would you stand this morning? We're gonna spend a few minutes praying. I'm going to ask you to be bold and courageous this morning, okay? In a couple of seconds, I'm going to ask you if you're here this morning and there's something that's come in your life in the last year, week, or months, and you don't know what to do with it. You're not sure how to make sense of it. You're not even sure where to turn. And I'm going to ask you to, in a couple seconds, I'm going to ask you, and I don't want you to be afraid. Listen, don't worry about who's standing next to you. Don't worry about who's looking. Don't worry about who doesn't raise their hand, because the truth is there's some people in this room that would have raised their hand a year ago. There's some people in this room that are going to raise their hand a year from now. because something's going to come. So don't worry about who's around you. I want to ask you this morning, in a couple seconds, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. If something's been dealt to you that you're not sure what to do with.
Thank you for listening to this podcast from TheAlley Church. More can be found at thealley.org. Follow Jesus, live love.